Buds. Welcome to another frightening episode of the Good Buds Ghostcast. Today's episode is a very special episode because it's a story written by me. That's right, this is something that actually happened to me that I can't explain and haunts my memories to this very day. This is the story of the old barn in the woods. Links to all of my stuff will be in the description below. Before I start, I would like to remind you to like, comment, subscribe, and share this podcast with all your friends who like scary stories and burning nuggets. I will now light the ceremonial incense, if you know what I mean. A long time ago, when I was just ass-high to a grasshopper, I visited my grandmother's house to hang out with my cousin. For the sake of the story, I'll call him Randy, while he was spending a few nights down visiting. As was the usual situation for our visits, the adults all gathered for wine and family gossip, very quickly sending us off to our own childish adventures. Sometimes it would be water fights taken deadly serious to the point of water tanks being thrown and blood being drawn, or just random wandering through the woods in nearby neighborhoods. On this specific occasion, though, we decided that it would be great to wander through the nearby woods pretending to be explorers out to experience a new and untamed wilderness. It was going pretty well early in the day with a few discoveries, such as a rusted out wheel, some car parts, and most interestingly of all, and totally unrelated to the creepiness of this story, but still odd enough to mention, what appeared to be an old sign for a business or a carnival or something. It was too faded to possibly tell what the word said, but the image was obviously colorful at some point and had a clown in the middle. Not a creepy murder clown, just a regular clown. My cousin thought our discoveries were signs that we had to keep going deeper, maybe to find the rest of the old car, or maybe even some more exciting things like an interesting rock to climb, and I was inclined to agree. We walked for a while longer, with me in the front zipping along with boundless energy that I miss more than anything about being young. I moved between a few trees and finally came to a sparse section and something that made me stop in my tracks, at least long enough for my cousin to catch up. "What's up?" Randy shouted, puffing slightly from the run to catch up. "Barn, dude," I said, as if it wasn't absurd for a barn to be in the middle of the woods for no reason. "There are no houses near here, are there?" Randy asked, looking around to confirm it for himself. "Not as far as I know. Doesn't look like anything's been here for a long time with how big the trees are," I replied, also looking around to confirm my own thinking. Obviously, being young idiots in an age before the internet made exploring outside unappealing, we decided to explore inside immediately, without making sure it was safe. Luckily for us, when we slid through the partially open front door, the inside looked in pretty good condition, aside from some thick dust and a few broken boards here and there. My cousin had an immediately uncomfortable feeling when we stepped inside. He described it like someone was poking him on the neck and ribs every few seconds, but just hard enough that it didn't make him jump. Which I thought was strange. I didn't really feel anything like that in the slightest. I was comfortable, actually. Like I'd been there before. Like it was somewhere I could relax and not be bothered by the world. Not being entirely a little sociopath, I conceded to my cousin, and we left still unsure about why or how the barn got into the middle of the woods. We didn't go back for the rest of the weekend, but I spent way too much time thinking about the barn until I was able to go back and visit my grandmother's house again. My cousin wasn't down visiting this time, but policy is policy, so I was quickly sent off to figure out something to do away from the parents and the adult conversation. As swiftly as I was dismissed, I was out the door and heading to the woods. I retraced our steps from the previous adventure, and after a stop at the absolutely in no way creepy clown sign, some more wandering, and a quick pause to check out a cool caterpillar, I came to the barn. Part of me had assumed it wouldn't be there and I would be forced into one of those situations from movies, where the kids tell the parents about a magical place and then they go to look for it and it's gone. I was lucky though, as the old thing was standing right where I left it. Once again I went straight inside, and the same feeling overtook me. I was just happy to be back there, and I didn't want to leave. I spent some time checking out the inside of the barn and the things left behind. It was obviously old and unused from the state of the woods around it and the equipment inside. There were a few old farm implements like a pitchfork and a broken axe. A few crates decorated the walls and hayloft with nothing of note in them. A few faded papers and old chisels on the workbench and dry oil lamp or two. Nothing really screamed paranormal or anything, just an old forgotten barn that someone couldn't be bothered to rip down when they moved. It never struck me that, with the age of the things inside, the barn should have definitely been falling apart without regular maintenance. I was a kid. You don't think about regular housing maintenance when you're a kid. So, after spending maybe half an hour or 45 minutes there, I left and headed back to my grandmother's house so I wouldn't worry my mother. When I got back, the parents were still heavily into gossip and supper was served shortly after. We went home and, again, I thought about the barn frequently. over the years, I went back to the barn many times. Sometimes with friends, sometimes with Randy. I would go there when I wanted to be alone or if I wanted to show someone a really interesting place that I just couldn't explain. As I got older, I would look for information about the property, but I could never find anything solid. Just a few old stories about farms that were abandoned after burning down, or properties that got abandoned as families moved or died off, but nothing specifically where the barn was. Some of my friends would get that odd feeling or bad vibe when visiting, and others wouldn't at all. Randy always would, and rarely would he actually come inside. It seemed almost entirely arbitrary who got the feeling, but it was obviously very polarizing. I had a few ground rules I would always tell people when they visited. Don't break anything, don't take anything, and treat the barn better than your own home. For the most part, people followed those rules, with a few exceptions. One time a board broke when my friend was in the hayloft messing around and nothing of note happened. Another time a friend accidentally dropped one of the old oil lamps and it cracked. Once again, nothing really noteworthy happened. It wasn't one of those curse situations or whatever, you know? I slowly turned into a young rebellious pothead, going on long bike adventures with my friends and finding random places to smoke away from prying eyes. Obviously, the barn was a fantastic place for this, and it became one of our regular hangout spots. Not long after I got my first serious girlfriend, and not long after that I lost my first serious girlfriend. Being an angst-filled teen with a tenuous grasp on my emotions, I was angry and looking for alone time. I wanted to go somewhere I could disappear for a few hours and just smoke weed. The barn was my first and only choice. I entered the barn close to when the sun would be going down, but being there was comfortable for me at night or the day. I'd never had any issues with it in the past. I entered and I lit up the flashlight on my Sony Ericsson piece of shit phone, and I sat down on my favorite box to smoke a bowl, only to realize I'd forgotten my lighter and my bowl at home. That was enough to tip my teenage angst into the red, and I quickly stood and kicked the box in front of me across the room into a wall. With the satisfying thudding and crunching sound, it came to a stop. It felt cathartic, I guess, because I found myself kicking the other boxes near me and eventually one of the support beams for the hayloft. It was then that I heard a loud crack and saw the beam split and fall slightly, causing the loft above to sag a little from the missing support. Immediately, I felt every ounce of comfort leave my body. The room, which just minutes earlier seemed brightly lit by my flashlight, now seemed dim and filled with shadows. Instead of safety, I felt every hair on my body telling me that I made a grave mistake. From somewhere above me in the hayloft, I heard a slow creak that my brain desperately tried to attribute to the broken support beam as I backward stepped towards the door. The door I had easily pulled closed behind me when I got there seemed to weigh a ton as I pushed it open, just enough for me to slip out and sprint to my bike. I don't think I blinked twice on my way home. The next day I felt horrible for what I had done. I'd gotten over my teenage high that only a violent outburst against inanimate objects can give you, and only had remorse for having broken a place that I came to care about. I decided to go back with some boards, a hammer, and some nails to try to repair the beam. I wasn't a carpenter by any means, but I was sure that I could reinforce it enough to keep it standing enough not to feel bad about breaking it in the first place. I made sure to go during the day, remembering the feeling of how the place had changed when I had broken the beam and thinking that it would be better to go during the lighter hours. I pulled the door open a bit wider and slid inside. I immediately had the sketchy, ominous feeling come back to me, but on top of that I noticed something really strange. The boxes were all back where they had been, as if I hadn't taken all my angsty rage out on them the night before, and even stranger, the beam that I distinctly remember breaking was completely intact. It looked as if it had never been broken or damaged in any way. In fact, the barn looked cleaner than it ever had before, lacking even the regular coat of dust that sat over everything. It was making me uncomfortable to look at, as if everything was wrong and I had to leave. I had never had such a strong feeling of flight or fight in my life, and thankfully, due to the love of horror movies I have, I chose flight. I left the barn and I tried my best to put it out of my memory. Until a couple years later, when a friend and I were talking about scary stories from when we were young and filled with adventure, we both mutually brought up the barn. I decided it was time to go back and visit, which clearly goes against what I said earlier about the whole learning from horror movies, but we can ignore that for now. I went to my grandmother's house and began the trek into the woods. It had been so long that I almost had forgotten the way, but the mostly rotted away clown sign let me know I was on the right path. After some time I came to a familiar copse of trees, but no barn. Gone were all the signs that any building had ever sat there. Not a board or scrap of paper was left that I could find. It was like it had never existed at all, and if it weren't for other people having been there and having memories of it, I would believe that was the case. As it stands, it's still a mystery to me now, years later. I have no closure or resolution to that chapter in my life that involved the barn. They ended up clearing and flattening the land for a small subdivision of duplexes for old people a few years back, so even if I wanted to investigate it more, it would be impossible. I often wonder about that barn. I think about how strange it was that it was there in the middle of the woods with no roads or obvious paths leading to it. I think about the fond memories of it being tainted by that feeling of fear after mistreating it, and I still wonder what would have happened had I not decided to run that night before the barn disappeared from my life. Maybe I would have gone with it. So that's it for today's story. I appreciate all of you lending me your ear holes, and I would love it if you could find the time to like, comment, subscribe, and share this podcast with all of your friends that like spoopy stories and own the finest of brown pants. Since I wrote today's story, I would like to encourage you to check out our Facebook page and our Anchor podcast, The Good Buds Podcast. The links will be below in the description. And thank you very much for tuning in. Stay spoopy, buds.